All right, guys. So just going ahead and actually getting into our chapter 2 lecture. Um, there are going to be, let me share screen. There's going to be a total of about four main points that this chapter is going to cover. All right. This chapter 2 states we're going to try to define the state. We're going to try to explain some of the origins of political organization, a little bit of the history of the modern state, and then we're going to try to compare state power from one state to another. That's going to be a big, important part of this chapter. So let's get straight to it. What is a state? A state is a human community that actually has a monopoly of legitimate use of physical force within a specific area. Okay. And so this definition was invented by a guy named Max Weber in 1919, and it remains the most popular definition of explaining what a state is to this day. Now, you're going to notice you're talking about a human community, meaning you're talking about an organization of people that has accepted the policing and military power or the monopoly of violence of the state or within a region, okay, within a defined territory. Now, it's important that you understand that when you're talking about states, they're going to be very protective of their sovereignty. Sovereignty is this idea that, or it's the notion of a state's ability to carry out actions and policies within a territory that is independent of external actors and internal rivals. So, sovereignty is going to talk about a state's ability to have laws in place and pass laws without the interference of other states, or without the interference of drug cartels or organized crime or terrorist groups within the state. Obviously, the more sovereign a state is, the more likely it's going to be considered a stronger state, a more powerful state. And the weaker the sovereignty within a state, then the weaker we consider that state. We call those weak states. Okay, but again, a state, this human community that has actually successfully monopolized the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, related or connected to this concept of state is sovereignty, which is the ability of a state to carry out actions and policies within a defined territory, independently of external actors like states and internal rivals like terrorist organizations, organized crime, drug cartels, so on and so forth. Okay, and so sovereignty grants the state the primary authority over its people. Okay, because there is sovereignty in a state, the state has the ability to pass and create laws. They have the ability to define and protect rights. They have the ability to resolve problems between people and organizations, and overall just protecting the people within that territory. That's what sovereignty grants a state. Now, again, these in focus sections are awesome for you guys to keep in mind when studying for the test and for the AP exam, because they really do a nice job of summarizing how to understand the definition of the meaning of the word state. A state is an organization that maintains a monopoly of force. That monopoly of force is going to be something you're going to see over and over again as the definition for a state. But it's got to be a monopoly of a force over a given territory. The state is a set of political institutions that generate and carry out policy. It's going to be highly institutionalized, meaning it's going to be very strongly self-perpetuating. It's going to vary from place to place, but it's going to be very well defined from an official standpoint, from a legal standpoint. We're going to know the state pretty well. It's going to be pretty institutionalized, very, very highly institutionalized. It's going to be sovereign, meaning that it's going to have the ability to carry out those actions that we talk about within their territory, independently of internal or external actors. And the state's also going to be exemplified by institutions like the army, like a police force, like the ability to collect taxes, like a judiciary, like a social welfare system. The social welfare system is a country's ability or how they choose to handle healthcare issues, education-based issues, so on and so forth. Okay. So that's the state. Now, when you're talking about the state, we can think of the state as the computer of, or the machine of a country. The regime is the software. How is it that that country has organized itself from a political standpoint? From what are the fundamental rules and norms politically that are found within a country? In other words, how does that country address long-term goals regarding individual and freedom and equality? Who has the like? Where is power granted? Is it in the executive branch, in the state, in the legislative branch? Is it going to be more power for the national government, or are there going to be regional governments that have more power? How is that power used? All of those are questions that are answered by the state's regime. All right. Now, a regime, the book is going to mention, is going to have norms and rules regarding individual freedom and collective equality, the locus of power and the use of that power. It's going to be institutionalized, but it can be changed by dramatic events such as a revolution. So if there's a revolution, there is no more regime. It's also going to be categorized at the most basic level as either democratic or authoritarian. So if you're ever lost as to how to define a regime, one way to start with that definition, it may not be the complete definition of a state's regime, but one way is to just focus on whether it's democratic or authoritarian. And last but not least, a regime is frequently going to be explained or defined within a country's constitution. Now, regimes are going to very rarely change. They're going to change. They're very highly institutionalized. Not as institutionalized as the state, but they're still going to be pretty institutionalized. They don't change very often, but they change with a little bit more frequency than a state. And that's the definition of a regime. The book is going to make a point of mentioning again how we can define or divide regimes into two categories: democracy and non-democracy. Examples of democratic regimes: constitutional monarchies. Okay, constitutional monarchy is what the United Kingdom has, where there is a hereditary monarchy that plays a largely symbolic role in the politics of the UK, but real power remains with the voters. Republics, which is what the United States has, they're going to be an example of a democratic regime, and they're going to have an elected head of state, like the president. We're going to talk about all this later on in the course, and there's also going to be a separation of powers. Wow, I had never seen this word. Consociational democracies are going to be power-sharing democracies that are going to be sharing power between ethnic or religious groups that are found within a state, so that no ethnic or religious group has the ability to pass laws without the consent of the other. You have to have both or all of the major groups in agreement in order for laws to get passed. Non-democratic regimes, you're looking at personalistic dictatorships. Personalistic dictatorships are probably an example of that is probably going to be Fidel Castro or Kim Jong-il. Military rule is when the military has taken over a country. You're going to see that happen pretty often in countries in Africa, where, for example, in Nigeria, throughout a lot of its history, the military has a coup d'etat. Coup d'etat means fall of the state. It really is fall of the regime, where the regime is overthrown and a new regime is replaced, headed by the military. And then last but not least, another example of non-democratic regimes are going to be the one-party regimes. That's what you see, for example, in China. It's what you see in Cuba, where the Communist Party of each of those countries has a monopoly over the ability over the ability to make laws, the ability to govern the country. Above the regime, as the very top of a pyramid, is what we consider the government. The government is the user who actually runs the software of the regime, of the computer that is known as the state. So the individual persons or peoples running the regime in the state at any given moment, those are the ones who are going to make up the government. The government's going to be made up of both the national leaders, the regional leaders, the legislative leaders, and also all those people. They're the ones that make the government. And the book makes a point of emphasizing that, again, the leadership or elite in charge of running the state is going to be government. The government's going to be very weakly institutionalized, meaning it's not going to be considered very strongly official. It's going to be not self-perpetuating. It's going to change a lot from time to time. It will be limited by the existing regime, meaning that the United States would struggle tremendously if out of nowhere one of the leaders in this country decided they wanted to make the country communist or fascist or so on and so forth, because the Constitution creates the democratic republic regime of the United States, and the democratic republic regime of the United States is pretty powerful and doesn't give a lot of leeway for other individuals to try and change the regime or so that a government can be in power forever. The government's always frequently going to be composed of elected officials like a president or a prime minister, or it's also going to be made up of unelected officials, perhaps like a monarch in England. Here in this chart, you're going to see the most institutionalized among the three terms is going to be the state. Secondly will be the regime. Last but not least, the government. The government's going to be very little regime, very little institutionalized. Why? Because governments can come and go. Governments can be replaced pretty easily. The people running the government can be changed pretty quickly. The textbook also wants to emphasize the definition of the word country. Country is the state government regime and the people who live within that political system. Okay. And it's going to include the state, the government, the regime, as well as the people who live in the political system of that area. Please understand that states, countries, and nations can mean different things. We're going to talk a little bit more about what these terms are in chapters 4 and 5, but for now, keep in mind that they are not the same. States, countries, and nations have different meanings. So in here you explain, or the book explains, how a country includes the state, the regime, the government. It also includes nations within it. And so the book asks, would you consider a militant group like ISIS a state? And I think the more, correct answer is probably going to be B and C. They do control territory, but I would argue that their territory is not, well, they don't even control a lot of territory right now. But I would have told you that the territory they did control varied a lot from time to time, and so I don't think it was stable enough or institutionalized enough for ISIS to have been considered a state. They also, I don't feel, protected the population within that region. And so I think that's another reason for why we wouldn't consider ISIS a state. Okay, so there's two ways that we organize politically. One is through what's called the consensus path of political organization. The other is the coercion path. If you believe in the consensus pathway, this is what leads to eventually democracy. Individuals end up getting together to protect themselves and create common rules. Eventually, leadership is going to be selected from among the people, and the idea is that we're going to acquire security through cooperation. On the other hand, coercion is when individuals are brought together by a ruler that uses their power, their monopoly on power, to impose authority. The idea here is you're going to receive security through domination. Okay. At the end of the day, the truth is we're not sure which made which. We're not sure if the consensus theory is accurate or if the coercion theory is accurate. There's a chance that both of these concepts went hand in hand, and that's how we ended up having our countries and states evolve the way that they did. So keep that in mind. The rise of the modern state. Okay. These are some of the important moments within history that helped lead to the creation of the state. I don't think you're ever going to get tested on this. That's a question more perhaps better suited for a world history class. But we think that modern states were created essentially in Europe, and that while places like the Middle East and China did have strong centralized bureaucracies, and some similar patterns also happened in Latin America and even Africa, At the end of the day, the definition, the most complete definition of what a state looks like was perhaps best answered within Europe. And so the question is, why is it that Europe became the place where the modern state was invented? There's a few different reasons for that. There's geography, the fact that Europe is in the middle of the old world, perhaps led it to be exposed to new ideas, which inevitably helped create this concept of the state. There's the idea that there was violence and anarchy, and that the only way for the groups to actually protect themselves was by the creation of the state. In other words, the organizational evolution of a state led the states to want to have states in order to have security. Of course, there's also the question of religious conflict, which means that religious conflict ended up breaking up the monopoly of power the Catholic Church used to have within Western Europe, and it was replaced by more states having or exercising their own sovereignty. Now, why is it that the modern world is a world of states? States tend to do a better job of organizing themselves than other political organizations. They do a better job promoting economic development. They do a better job creating technology. They do a better job of creating domestic stability by encouraging interaction, economic and all. I'm sorry, by creating interactions and by creating a sense of shared identity, which is what we call nationalism. Now, the state did lead to the creation of the term imperialism. The state creates this concept of imperialism. However, imperialism did spread the concept of the state throughout the rest of the world. Okay. So, comparing state power, how is it the United States government stays in power? The answer, in theory, is it's not really based off of fear alone, even though people do obey to avoid punishment. It's not because of bribery. At the end of the day, perhaps the most common reason for why the United States government remains in power is because of the values that we have and the fact that we have citizens who believe and obey what they think is right because it is right. But understand that rulers may use different tactics to remain in power. They may use fear as a means of punishing those who disagree with the rulers. They may use rewards as a means of bribing supporters. They may also use this concept known as legitimacy, which is the idea that the public accepts institutions that have the right to exist. And legitimate states are almost always more subtle than other states. Three main types of legitimacy. You need to know this for the rest of the course. You need to know this for the AP test. Traditional legitimacy is built by habit and custom over time. It stresses history and it is strongly institutionalized. So traditional legitimacy grants legitimacy to a state because the state has been doing the same operations for a very long time, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Charismatic legitimacy is built on the force of ideas and the presence of the leader. It is weakly institutionalized. It's literally just going to be either a group of leaders or, more likely than not, it's going to be the top guy and the other dogs. Rational legal legitimacy, on the other hand, is going to have characteristics where it is built on rules and procedures in the offices that create these and enforce these rules. It's strongly institutionalized. So the regime is built on rules and procedures, and because of this, it grants the state a rational legal legitimacy that's not common elsewhere. Perhaps examples of how this would work might be in 2018 when we had a change of no, not in 2018, whenever there's a newly elected official, that's how you can see that the change in governments is respected because of the fact that we have rational legal legitimacy of elections. So again, just to kind of quickly summarize this, traditional legitimacy is built by habit and custom. It is the institutionalization of traditional legitimacy is very strong. Examples of traditional legitimacy are going to be the British monarchy and the Saudi royal family. Okay. Charismatic legitimacy, you're going to see Putin's Russia be an example of it. You're also going to see Nelson Mandela's post-apartheid South Africa as being examples of charismatic legitimacy. And charismatic legitimacy is going to be built by the force of ideas and the presence of a leader. It's going to be very weakly institutionalized. Once the leader dies, the institutions are no longer many times present anymore. But for the duration of however long the charismatic leader lives, the legitimacy of some countries is many times rooted in charismatic legitimacy. Last but not least, rational legal legitimacy is going to be built by rules and procedures. The offices creating and enforcing these rules, the institutionalization level is going to be strong. Examples of rational legal legitimacy are going to be the U.S. president. The British monarch the British prime minister, I'm sorry, is also going to be an example of rational legal legitimacy. I was surprised to see the textbook mention this a little bit, so I'll go over it pretty quickly. There's two ways to disperse power between the states, within a state. One is what's known as federalism. Federalism grants individual regional governments significant powers, like the power to tax, like the power to pass certain laws, like the power to have some security resolved within their area. And so these powers are shared between the national and the regional governments, which means relative to other formats, the federalist format is designed to create stronger regional governments than people would otherwise expect. On the other hand, unitary states are going to have very limited regional governments with very limited power, and most of the power instead is going to be concentrated at the national level. Okay. Aside from federalism and unitary states, you're going to discover that in some instances, right? And here's an example of federalism at work. The central government shares equally powers with the regional governments. There's two different main types of federalism. One is going to be considered the symmetric federalism, which means that all regions have the same amount of power. On the other hand, asymmetric federalism is going to be where different regions have different amounts of power, like Canada. Quebec is going to have certain powers as a province of Canada regarding taxation and healthcare that other provinces in Canada will just not have the power to grant themselves. And here's how we're going to distribute power in a unitary system. The central government is going to be the main big government, with it telling regional governments what they may or may not do. Okay. The concept of devolution means that you're transferring power and funding from national, local governments. It's not the same thing as federalism. Devolution is when the national government decides to grant more power closer to the people as represented by their local representatives. And ideally, you want to actually increase state legitimacy because the state's going to be recognized as being more fair given how given how power is more fairly is shared, is more fairly shared between the state and national government. The key difference with federalism is that devolution is less permanent. It's less permanent. Okay. Strong states versus weak states. Why do we care about this issue of strength of state? Strong states are going to be able to fulfill basic tasks. Weak states are going to be unable to fill executive basic tasks. Whereas failed states are states that are so weak that their very basic state structures have broken down. In terms of weak states or fragile states, you're going to discover here that Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, those are the weakest states. None of the countries except Nigeria that I can see quickly off the top of my head list are found in the top 20 fragile states. I'm not sure that this was released. This was released in 2019. Another way we can compare state power is the state's capacity and the state's autonomy. The state's capacity refers to the state's ability to wield power to carry out basic tasks. So Yemona. State autonomy, on the other hand, is going to be the ability to wield power independently of the public or international actors. It's going to be very closely related to this concept of sovereignty. And here you see a chart of the mixes and matches between high autonomy and high capacity and low autonomy, low capacity and high capacity, and low authority and low autonomy. Okay. Here you're going to see how some of these may look in actual life. If a state has high capacity and high autonomy, it's going to be considered a strong state. The state's going to be able to fulfill basic tasks. They're going to be punishable, minimum public intervention. However, it's going to be very highly centralized power. A disadvantage is going to be that it may undermine democracy, high capacity and high autonomy. High capacity, low autonomy, the state's going to be able to figure out what to do, and it's going to be able to figure out its basic tasks. Maybe sorry. So high capacity, low autonomy, state is able to fulfill basic tasks. The public is going to help determine policy and limits that the state's power has. A disadvantage to high capacity and low autonomy is that the state may be unable to develop new policies and respond to new changes. Okay. And then I would probably recommend that you guys go over the in summary section. The state is a highly institutionalized political organization that has sovereignty. Power in the states is shaped by the regimes and governments. The modern state evolved in the highly competitive anarchic state of Egypt. So modern state evolved in a highly competitive and anarchic system of Europe. States are going to rely on different types of legitimacy. Why? To keep stability. And states are going to differ in how power is going to be spread out between the national and regional governments. The strength or weakness of a state is better measured by considering the state's capacity and autonomy. And that's it. That's the end of this chapter. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Bye, everybody.